Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we'll delve into the rich tapestry of life on the North Fork of Long Island. Here we shine a light on the issues and opportunities that shape our community, and we celebrate the people and the stories that define our past and present. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 62, our guest today is Rabbi Gadi Capela of the Congregation Tifereth Israel in Greenport, which is one of the two oldest synagogues on Long Island. Rabbi Gadi shares his roots, which stretch back to Yemen, where his family had to leave and move to Israel, where he grew up. He shares with us tales of his school days and his time in the military, his formative years that shaped his understanding of the world. We also discuss how he decided to move to New York City and worked on Wall Street. Between that time, he had a calling to dig deeper into his heritage. This quest led him to rabbinical school, a journey of faith and discovery. Eventually, Rabbi Gadi made his way to Greenport, where he became the spiritual leader of Congregation Tifereth Israel. He also embarked on Project Genesis, a groundbreaking initiative that blends Jewish and Christian teachings. He also speaks passionately about fostering interreligious harmony in the Holy Land, sharing insights into the challenges and the work that lies ahead. And lastly, we discuss what he hopes for the future of the North Fork and its community. So I hope you enjoy episode 62 with Rabbi Gadi Capela. This episode was recorded April 1st, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Chris.
So I'd like to just start off with an introduction where you were born and raised.
So I was born in Israel in 1972 in a place called Petach Tikva, which means the gate of hope. And it's actually the first Hebrew city in the modern Jewish state of Israel. So I was born there, and I was raised in Israel. We moved right away to a place called Rehovot, like Rehovot, Maryland. Everybody thinks it's an Indian name, but it's actually a biblical name, Rehovot. And so that is my hometown in Israel. It's where the Weizmann Institute for Sciences and the University of Agriculture is there too. So Rehovot is a beautiful little city. And that's where I grew up. And at 18, like every Israeli, you have to go to the army. And I I was conscripted in 1991. It was during the Gulf War. And I served for 4 years as a rescue officer in a unit that was formed during the Gulf War.
And where is Rehoboth in relation to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem?
So it's about 25 miles south of Tel Aviv, so pretty close and not too far from the coast.
And then in terms of your ancestry, how far back, or in terms of where you're, I guess on your mother's or father's side, how far back can you trace with your ancestry?
So the story of my family, my family came from Yemen. So we are Jews from Arab countries. Many people in America don't really realize that the Jewish people have different colors and different, it's not just that we look differently, but for thousands of years we never left the Middle East. And we are indigenous in the Middle East. But in 1951, shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel, it got to be intolerable for Jews to be living in Arab countries. So there was a mass migration, expulsion in 1951, and my parents, with other 40,000 Jews, had the modern day exodus from Yemen, and they had to walk for nearly a year in the desert, and until they got to Aden, and Aden, they waited several months there as refugees to be flown to Israel. So my parents were 5 and 7, so definitely a big event. So I'm a first generation, literally born in the modern state of Israel after 2,500 years of being in Yemen, which is around the corner, of course, still in the Middle East. But it was part of the Ottoman Empire, too, for, of course, all the many years. So that is where they came from.
And like you said, that goes way back in Yemen, a long time. And so your grandparents moved?
Yeah, they came with their grandparents. Right. Their grandparents, or my grandparents, all 4 of them, and with their families and everybody else. Some of them died on the way from thirst. There were my oldest 2 nephews were already born in Yemen to my father and my mother's older siblings, and they died on the way of thirst, unfortunately. So they were there. The story goes, at least the tradition is, that they were sent there by King Solomon as emissaries after the story of the Queen of Sheba. So Ethiopia and Yemen, they're just across the channel. So it's the same area. One is of course, in Africa, and one is in Arabia, but still it's the same region. So that's the tradition, that they were sent there as emissaries. And probably most of them were Levites. All the Yemenite Jews like to sing, like the Levites in the temple. So and the Levites' cities were the refuge cities, and almost like like embassies around the world for the Judean Empire, because the Levites did not receive biblically their own land, contiguous land, and they actually were kind of sent to live with the other tribes of Israel, because their responsibility was to take care of the temple. So they did their duty, and then they went back to their homes, but they didn't have a section in the land of Israel called the Levi section, like all the other tribes. So they were really sent out to be emissaries and have cities of refuge for Jews and, the ambassadors.
And then did you get to meet some of your grandparents?
That's a great question. Yeah, I met 3 of them. I knew 3 of them out of the 4. My paternal grandmother died before we were all born. My mother actually was before my parents were married. They dated before my mother came here. It was like 64 and 65. And then when my grandmother passed away, my mother returned to Israel, and then they built their lives in Israel.
But did they have any other stories about living in Yemen that you thought might be interesting, or even kind of leading up to before? Because I know you said why they left, but kind of just some other stories that might have come up that really kind of...
Absolutely. There are many stories, and actually the reality that we live now, what happened, especially after October 7th, and I was on the Columbia campus at the time, and I'm still writing my final project now, but to see that even my classmates never knew about the fact that Jews didn't all come from Europe, but even the Jews that came from Europe, they were It was just that they were expelled, but they always felt connection to the land, always visited, sent money, or whatever they could be connected to the land of Israel, they were. But most Israelis, Jewish Israelis today, are actually not from Europe and never left the Middle East and never stepped foot in Europe. So to say that Israel is a Western country is inaccurate. It has Western spirit and people, but some of them, not all of them. But we really are an Eastern country and an Eastern religion. Judaism is not a Western religion. By extension, of course, Christianity, especially Roman Catholicism, became the Roman Empire's religion at a certain point, and became Western in one sense. But we're Eastern people. Mm-hmm. So the Arabs and the Jews, for centuries, lived. I can't say that it was totally peaceful. It was not, but it was definitely nothing like in Europe, and the rocky relationship that Jews had with Christianity for many years. It just in the last century it flipped, and we became somehow adversaries or there's an adversarial relationship between Jews and Muslims, but they lived in the Arabia before Islam. Islam started in the 600s, and they lived there before the Common Era. But once Islam came to be, they really became second-class citizens. It's called a dhimmi. It took it's supposed to be a protected minority, but usually the reality was different. If a Jew rode a donkey, right, they had to step down. If a Muslim walked by, to not be higher than a Muslim. They couldn't own anything, couldn't own land. They just had their home. And even the wood that they had to use for fire had to be stored inside the house, as not to use Muslim land. But again, my mother also and my parents both say that when they left, their neighbors were crying, and they were very good friends with the people that they lived with, the Muslims. In general, yes, they had a different status, but their day-to-day life were okay. But when it became real political with the establishment of the modern state of Israel, they really had to leave. So you have a combination of really being a time capsule in Yemen, because when they came to Israel in 1951, these people never saw an airplane, never saw a mirror. They would use trays, like silver trays as mirror. And there's a funny story of my mother and her mother when they came to Israel. And the first time they opened a closet that had a mirror inside it, and they freaked. My mother said her mother freaked out. She jumped back. She was afraid. She thought somebody was in the closet. So it's funny. But on the other hand, my grandfather looked like both of them. They looked like Moses. The same garb, the same look, with, of course, the sideburns. Yes. The curly sideburns. My father had sideburns until he was 9, and then he went to a kibbutz in Israel, a very secular place, and they kind of cut his peyot. So it was a combination. They allowed him to be very religious in Yemen. There was never that issue that Jews, like in Europe, were curtailed religiously, or in any way were diminished that way. But when it came to political sovereignty, that was not allowed. And that is actually the roots, and this is what I'm writing about now for my master's, is the roots of the conflict today. Didn't start in October 7th or 1948 or even before that. It really is a religious conflict about sovereignty over the land. Muslims believe that any place that was ever Muslim is Muslim forever. And therefore, Jews cannot, even if it was their land, now, once it became Muslim one time during the Ottoman Empire, then it's Muslim forever. We have a different story, right? Mm-hmm. We've been there for 4,000 years. Mm-hmm. To say the Jews are not indigenous in the land is, silly. And I'm definitely a descendant of people that left. About 1 million Jews lived in Arab countries before 1948. Mm-hmm. And in the surrounding years of 1948, they all had to leave. So nearly 1 million Jews were displaced from Arab countries and came to Israel or America, mostly Israel. Mm-hmm. So that same time when Arabs were displaced from what was called that area, geographic area, mm-hmm. Palestine at the time, again, almost 1 million of Jews were displaced. So it was about the same number, about 750,000 Arabs who were mm-hmm. displaced, and about 850 to 1 million Jews that were displaced from Arab countries.
Okay.
So,
and then, because you said, or you grew up in Rehovot?
Yes, I grew up in Rehovot.
Where did your grandparents settle when they first came?
Yes, so my mother's family settled near Rehovot in a town just next to Rehovot called mm-hmm. Kiryat Ekron, and like Akron, Ohio, same name, and it's actually a sister city, town. And then my father's family went to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is another Yemenite settlement, in a sense of they all mm-hmm. came and settled in the same area. Mm-hmm. So it's like the two centers of the Yemenite Jews in Israel. Mm. And then after my mother came back from the United States, then they moved to Rehovot.
Okay. But both of your parents grew up in Israel and went mm-hmm. to school.
Yep.
And what did they do for a living?
So my father was a project manager for a big construction company in Israel. And so I grew up on, big construction sites. They built tunnels and bridges and, big places, big buildings. And so I was part of that scene. And then we built our own house for 15 years. When I was in high school, we moved to the house actually in Akron, next to where my mother's family was. And then later on, he worked for the biggest dairy company in Israel. Mm-hmm. But really, the main years of growing up was when he was in a construction project manager. And then my mother was worked in a publishing company. Mm-hmm. And so she would do she would be the typo. Typo is she would look for.
So like kind of an editor.
An editor.
Yeah.
Like the it wasn't the editor,
but
she was the proofreader.
Proofreader.
Yeah. And
did you say your dad grew up in a kibbutz?
He didn't grow up in a kibbutz, but he studied. They at 9. So he came at 7, so I don't know exactly what happened actually that year, but they mm-hmm. were, they had to live in tents. They lived in tents for couple of years, mm-hmm. More than 2 years, 3 or 4 years. So the education system at the time, the established education system was at bigger cities and kibbutzim, and it was more of the European establishment. Mm-hmm. So he went there. He went to the kibbutz, mm-hmm. and that's where he studied.
Okay.
So it's a very much a combination of very east and very west.
Yes.
Very religious, very secular.
Yes.
And the word Rehoboth means wide and diverse. And actually, I've been writing about it for many years. The concept from Egypt to Rehoboth. Because Egypt in Hebrew means narrow. And it means the birthplace of the Jewish people as a nation, right? After the slavery and they came out. But the direction, the spiritual direction, is to go towards width, the wideness, the diversity. So you come from narrow and dark and slavery, and which was pretty much like death. And the idea of the resurrection, like we're celebrating now our Christian friends, and Passover, it's the same idea. It's the resurrection. We were dead and we resurrected. So, and that really is the story of the Jewish people, and by extension of the Christian story. So, but Rehovot is also the name for the third temple, the future temple that the Jews will build. But if you look at it literally or figuratively, the concept is to go from narrow to wide. And that Rehoboth experience that I experienced, and of course my parents in many ways, is that diversity. If there were an enclave of Jewish life in Yemen for centuries and millennia, really, here they were blended into, my homeroom class had 25 different nationalities. All Jews that came from all over the world, but out of 40 kids, we were from 25 countries.
Wow. And
they all spoke the language, they ate the food, they sang the song. And so it was an experience of amazing time in the history of the Jewish people. I mean, to return like that after thousands of years to our homeland.
Because it was kind of somewhat, people were dispersed for a while and then coming back like that.
Right, but what most people don't know and don't really understand, that there was always a Jewish community in the land of Israel. Not as a sovereign state, but there was always Jewish representation in the land. The Jewish people never lost their connection to the land. So those who came even from the United States, they, their history is linked to Israel, via Europe, via whatever other places. But they originally are from there, and they've never lost that connection. So there was always representation, Jewish representation in the land.
And then just for you kind of growing up in Israel, how was it growing up, and what kind of activities, any fun activities you did as a child growing up?
So because of my parents' story that they grew up in very religious families, but then when they came to Israel, they really were part of a more secular world. I had the same combination in my life. First, because my siblings and I did not grow up in the religious sector of Israel. The education system in Israel is divided to secular and religious. It's both public schools, but you have to choose which one you want to go to. And out of the whole extended family, we were the only nuclear family that did not go to religious schools. So we were secular Israelis. But on Shabbat, we were very traditional. We would go to synagogue every Friday night and Saturday morning. My brother and I are, my sisters couldn't read the Torah because in Orthodox synagogues, women did not participate in that. Now I'm a conservative rabbi, so our synagogue is fully egalitarian. Men and women are fully equal in the service and outside the service. But in Israel, it wasn't common to have Reform or conservative synagogues. Really, it was either you went to synagogue or didn't go to synagogue. But if you went to synagogue, it was most likely an Orthodox synagogue. So on Shabbat, we would do that, and my brother and I would read from the Torah in a Yemenite synagogue. It's very unique to the Yemenite Jews, of all Jews in the world. We get as children, we get the same aliyah, the same going up to the podium to read the Torah. and participate as adults. So my brother and I read the Torah from, as soon as we could read. So that's one thing. But then because my father was also in construction, we always had big trucks and big cars. And so we would travel a lot. Every Shabbat we'd go to synagogue and then come back from synagogue, or sometimes not go to synagogue, but just travel a lot. So traveling has been something, an experience for me that, of course, accompanied me for the rest of my life. I'm a traveler, a lot of that. And then we grew up in a theater. The other part of our lives was theater. My brother was a kid star in Israel. When he was 16, he had a major role in a family movie. Became famous, and the whole thing. He was very talented before that too, always singing and had bands, but of course that was a different step. And then I followed up with that, so I studied theater for 6 years too, my whole until I finished high school, and I wrote and directed and played in plays. But once I went to the Army, that kind of went out the window. And but what I do now is is in a sense, it's not theater, because this is why I didn't follow with theater, because it was fun when I did it. I don't see it as my calling to be in theater, but clearly I speak publicly and I'm on the stage in one sense.
Definitely. But then you mentioned a bit in school that in terms of how your environment was in school, you said it was very diverse and you were interested in theater, but how else was the school environment for you?
It was amazing. I loved growing up. I knew I was in a very rich place. And again, not necessarily financially, although people were well-to-do, but that wasn't the main, why I thought it was rich. It was because of the education. It was half of my class, the kids of my class were children of professors, because it's where we live. And they've traveled, and they were expats in different places and taught in different universities in the world. So that was such wealth that you knew that you're in a center of wealth of information and cultural diversity. So it was great. And Rehovot is a city that everybody lives together somehow harmoniously. If you're rich or poor, if you're Sephardi or Ashkenazi, these terms, Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews came from the east, and Ashkenazi Jews came from the west. If you are religious or secular, it doesn't matter. Somehow we all blended, and it was great. That was the main impact I had, and that's why education for me is the number one.
And coming out of school, you mentioned that, you were still interested in theater, but you knew you had to go into the Army. So it's kind of interesting comparing it to with the U.S., kind of figuring out what people want to do right out of high school. They might not know, but having this kind of in between where you go into the Army, how is that experience?
It was very good, and I recommend that America institutes at least 2 years of civil service after, and I recommend that in Israel too. I think in Israel, I'm excluding what's going on right now, of course, but in general, 3 years for men and 2 years for women is a long time to give. But I served for 4 years because I was an officer, but still, 3 years is a long time. So I think 2 years to standardize 2 years after the high school, you're still a kid, you don't really know what you want, do 2 years of giving back to your country and figure out what you want to do. If some people want to serve these 2 years in the military, great. But you have to have that.
Something with somewhat giving back to the country.
Of course. That's one. And for your own sake, I when I came to America, I went to college here. I was older because I started college at 24 because I had 4 years in the military. So I came here at 22 right after the service. But I traveled for a whole year. And then I started. So I was by then 24. So Israelis normally start college at this time. So I recommend it very much. It definitely, I became a man, from a kid to a man in those 4 years.
Yes. What did you kind of feel that you learned through that? Was it because some people aren't sure over here what they do, and maybe they can go to community college or something, or they decide not to, but was it a good experience because some people might think of the military more as a strict, regimented environment, but
It was.
But it was still good overall.
Absolutely. First of all, because in Israel, it's a small country, and everybody kind of knows everybody. So you're with your friends a lot of times, and if they weren't friends before, you made friends, and military friends stay forever. You are friends with these people forever. So it is a very, very good experience to have as a person. But what it did to me is I'm always going to be a soldier, just like I'm always going to be a rabbi, right? Yes. So once you have these experiences, they never leave you. So whatever you do, the discipline, we were very disciplined at home too, but the military is a different level. When you have to wake up every morning at 4:00 and go, get your weapon ready and then run and be in a challenging environment that way. You have to run, jump, and then be in tents, live in tents. So camping is nothing, right? When people go on glamorous camping, it was a glamping. Yeah. As an expression now. So it's not like that. You sleep on a cot if you have it, otherwise just in a sleeping bag on the ground. So I did that for a long time, and then I went through a lot of training in the military because it was a new formed unit. So we didn't have all our own facilities, so I had to go and train in different units in the Army. So it was amazing. I had an amazing service. At the end, I actually wrote a presentation to Ehud Barak, who was the chief of staff at the time. He was just leaving the military as I was at the same time. He was the chief of staff exactly the 4 years I served in the military. And they asked me to write the presentation, being the first officer from that unit, and to kind of capture the development of that unit for 4 years and a new command. They started a whole new 5th command in Israel. So I was asked to do that. So that's what I did for my last period of the Army, and then I just had to leave. It was too much. It was good. It was amazing, and they wanted me to stay for another 6 years with education, everything. But you have to understand something about Israelis who, especially first generation Israelis. What does that mean? To return to your Commonwealth, the third Commonwealth, after all this time, it has to be reinterpreted, because everybody came from with their traditions now that they've amassed in different places in the world, and they have to come together and form something that would be more representative of modern state of Israel, and especially as being politically sovereign. That's a very big difference. So if you're not connected to your Jewish roots, if you're just a secular Israeli and you think that you can survive the pressure of what Israel's going through internally and externally without being really connected to the Jewish roots and the land, it's very tough. So I really came here to explore that. After the military experience, when I understood and I was exposed to information that made me worry. And I didn't know why they hate us so much. Why are we in constant wars? Why? What is this reason? And I started my journey, and something happened to me. I guess this is a good story for this, because for me that was the pivotal experience. My last week of the army, I was already exploring schools, and the one school I wanted to go to in Israel was an architectural school in Jerusalem. It's called Bezalel. Bezalel was the artist that constructed the Ark of the Covenant. So it's named after him, and it's a very well-known school in Israel. And I thought, if I'm going to stay in Israel, I want to go to that school. I always wanted to be an architect. The day I went to the open house to register, I found myself in the biggest funeral in the history of Israel until today. A big rabbi, he was the greatest in his generation. That's the term. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Mm-hmm. It was February 20th, 1995. And I was, at that point, I didn't even go with my military uniform. I was just jeans and t-shirt. Mm-hmm. And I was supposed to climb the big wide avenue really, that the funeral went down. The school was at the top of that hill. It's called the Bezalel Street in Jerusalem. And imagine, they estimate about 500,000 people came from all over the world within 24 hours. So I, first of all, as a secular Israeli at that point, I did not even hear his name ever. Didn't even know who that person was, which is sad on its own. The disconnect between the religious and the secular mindset and communities in Israel. It's a little better now, but still there's that tension. And I was climbing up, and 500,000 people came down. That they were all black, wearing black, and the black hat, and they were ultra Orthodox, and the women were on the sides of the street, and the men were coming down, and they were chasing the car. It was an ambulance that the body was in. That they, in Israel, you don't bury in a coffin. You bury directly with just shrouds. So his body was carried in that ambulance, and at a certain point, everybody wants to touch that ambulance and be in his presence. And I was pushed on that ambulance, and it was. But I came out with this experience thinking to myself, I am so disconnected from my tradition. I'm a first-generation Israeli after all these hundreds of years, and my father had still peyot. He had the sideburns, and they were fully immersed in Judaism. And here I am, one generation later, and I am not versed in Judaism. I don't know why these people had light in their eyes as they were chasing their rabbi. It was amazing to see. They didn't even look at me. They were looking beyond me. And I was like a salmon trying to get to the top of the hill. But by the time I got to the top of the hill, I was a different person. I didn't know it at the time. I just thought I'd been through a big experience. But one thing I promised myself after that experience is that at least wherever I land in the world and my next step, I would study Jewish studies to see what I am not connected to. And then eventually I arrived in New York, and I went to Yeshiva University, and I studied business and Jewish studies. It's a dual curriculum program. And very shortly after, I became an observant Jew, and it took me a long time to become a rabbi, but I still...
But because you said your parents were still very much involved within the Judaism, but you coming out of... Was it more coming out of high school, or that you were more secular in that sense? And were your parents kind of, would they question you or kind of say, what, it's up to you to decide more so?
No, we were pretty secular at home. I mean, we kept kosher, of course, but we were a secular family on the weekdays. I mean, it's hard to explain Americans,
Yeah.
but think about maybe a conservative Jew or a Reformed Jew that they're not really observant at home. But we ate kosher. That was never an issue. But, we would drive on Shabbat. I mean, there was we were on the secular side no, there was never pressure either way. And it's very interesting with my parents. I think the biggest credit I give them is that they were seriously not oppressive in any way. They were, or coercive, not oppressive. It's not the right word, but really coercive in any way. If you wanted to do something, you did it. If you want to go to synagogue, you go to synagogue. And never forced us, my father never forced us, to go with him. So it was kind of, it developed naturally. And so I never had anything against religion or Judaism, never. I was like the story of Passover a little bit?
A little bit.
So it's all in the story of Passover. We're getting ready to celebrate Passover in 3 weeks, and usually Passover and Easter are in the same kind of weekend, or at least close in proximity. But this year, because the Jewish calendar it's a leap year on the Jewish calendar, and we have an extra month, so it pushes everything. Because we follow the lunar calendar and not the solar, but we adjust to the solar calendar every Passover. So Passover is always in the spring. That's how it works. So the story of Passover in the Haggadah, the book that we read on the Passover night, is all about telling the story of how we used to be oppressed, how we used to be slaves, and now we're free. But in order to not be oppressed and not go back to slavery, not go back to Egypt, to narrowness, you have to educate yourself. That's why education is always the key. So the whole story of Passover that evening is to educate the children, to tell the story. But the story involves 4 children. And it says the smart, the wicked, the simple, and the one who does not know how to ask. And you can look at it as 4 generations of immigrants or any experience a fundamental experience that you have, that you've been through, that you have to remember. Because otherwise you're due to repeat it, doomed to repeat it. So the 4th child, the 4th generation, the wise, still knows the tradition of his or her parents. The 2nd generation, the wicked, asks the question a different way. That's why they're called wicked. Again, take it in, not wicked, doing mischievous things. It's wicked in the way that they ask the question. So the question is, his question was, or her question is, why is it pertaining to me? What do I have to do with your story that you had when you came, through Ellis Island, from, Italy, or from any experience of the Holocaust? Well, that's our business, to impart that education on the child, that he or she knows exactly what signs to look for that are harbingers of good things and bad things. So the 2nd child asks, what does it have to do with me? The smart one, the first one, the wise one asks, what is it for us? Right? He says, what is it for you? The 3rd generation is a simple generation. They're neither here nor there, but they don't really know, right? The 4th generation doesn't even know what they don't know. They don't know how to ask. They have no vocabulary. So in one sense, I was the child that couldn't ask, because I just really didn't have... I had a lot of education. In Israel, you have a lot of biblical education, But if you're in the secular system, education system, you really don't get the faith. And if you don't have the faith, it's a very temporary fire. It's not the eternal fire. And that's the biggest difference.
In terms of, you said after you had that moment in Israel, in Jerusalem, where you were like, I wanted to study more, or Jewish studies, but what kind of made you decide to go to yeshiva in New York? Or like, why you didn't want to go to Europe or didn't want to stay in Israel? Right. What kind of...
Right. So I needed to leave Israel and unpack. That's why I didn't stay in the army, because I really was at a point where I needed a lot of answers for myself, my personal life, my identity, but also Israel was in a very toxic space at that point. It was 6 months before Rabin was assassinated. I left I moved to New York in May 95. I finished my army service at the end of February, so 3 months later I was already in New York, as I didn't get accepted to that school in Israel, in Jerusalem. And this is the condition I made with myself. If I get in, I stay in Israel. If not, I have to go. And I was exploring Les Sorbonne in Paris and different places. But when I arrived in New York, the friends of the family that I stayed with actually rented their basement apartment for a little while until I moved to Manhattan. They were involved with Yeshiva University, and they asked me, "So, what do you want to do?" And I said, I want to travel, but I also want to then eventually, when I get to school, I want to study Jewish studies. And they said, oh, Yeshiva University is great. There's a dual curriculum. You have whatever you want to study and Jewish studies. So that's how I ended up there. At that point, I didn't know what it meant to be an Orthodox Jew, I have to say. And that I will become Orthodox. I just thought, I'm just going to be there and just study. This is what I just need the information. But very shortly after, I realized that why my parents and everybody else's parents held on to their Jewishness for all these hundreds and millennia, because there's something there. It's the eternal fire. It's the eternal fire. And once you connect to it, just like Moses meeting God in the burning bush, you see it, you understand it, you feel it, and everything else becomes actually secondary.
No, and then I was curious what you thought, because you had started at yeshiva, and I was curious what you thought of the community in New York, even the Jewish community, and interacting with, because coming from Israel, how was that experience? Did it something seem different? And...
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I had a couple of culture shocks, if you want to call it this way. One, I have to say, the first one was when I asked people their names, and they would say, so then I would ask, what does that mean? What does your name mean, or what does that street's name mean, or that place name mean? And I got the same answer all the time. It's just a name. You don't understand what it does to even a secular Israeli, because we're such a, the meanings of names and names is such a, it's so prevalent in our tradition that the name is your essence. So when you ask somebody's name, you just don't, it's not just the informational name, how to call them. You want to know their essence. So that was one big culture shock. The second one had to do with the medical insurance. I really met so many anxious people They became sick because of the health system. They were so anxious about their health insurance, which was, of course, very expensive, and that it was connected to your workplace. So if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. I mean, in Israel, it's not
federal.
It's a state provided, and so Israelis don't have to think about these things. It's a little different now. They have to augment it with private insurance to get a full service, I think, in some ways. But the basics, you don't walk around always nervous about if something happens to you. You have to go to the hospital. You have to pay this. You have to pay that. That is one of the biggest issues I've had moving here. I mean, thank God, of course, I kept through schools and work and health insurance, of course, but still, it's very expensive. It's linked to your job, and now it's not with the Obamacare, but for many people it's still. And the fact that it doesn't come with your either citizenship or residency.
It's not a given.
It's not a given. That's the thing. It's not one of the
you're on your own
inalienable rights that we are supposed to have in the land. I would say that it means that, and then of course later on when I went to work in on Wall Street, you see that it's the capitalistic country. But the good thing about it is that I really know the people, and the people's heart is not all in capitalism. The American people are good people. They're beautiful. I mean, I was and I would say the third culture shock was to find out that actually America is a lot more conservative than Europe, or in many ways secular, Israel. More traditional, more conservative in the way people dress, the way they talk, in many ways. So, and it's a religious in many ways. It's a faithful country. So,
yes.
Maybe I knew from my mother's story of Berkeley in the '60s.
Because she came over.
She went to that's where she lived. She finished high school there in a foreign-born student program. And I thought, and of course all the sexual revolution and all the liberalism stemmed from Berkeley.
Yes.
So I thought, that's America.
Yes.
But even New York is, there's a lot of tradition, a lot of conservatism, and I think it's a very good balance, and I hope we don't lose it.
And you mentioned that you did Jewish studies and business at yeshiva. After you graduated, did you start working on Wall Street?
Yeah, so I really wanted to continue studying at that point. I mean, 4 years of college, I was an Orthodox Jew at that point, and all I wanted to do is study Torah, but I had to go to work, and some of my family said, you can always return to Jewish studies, and at the time I agreed to that, and I got into this business analyst program in one of the major banks, and of course that was right before 9/11 in 2001, and that changed. I was already working in different banks before that, from 97, I would say, with my internships, and so it was about 10 years in the business before coming to rabbinical school and then to Greenport. But what I had to go to work, so I did that, and but at a certain point, I did return to school, to Yeshiva University, for a master's in medieval philosophy, because I needed it for myself. So I worked and then took classes in the evening as late as I could, so I could be immersed in it again. I had to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finished that master's, I realized that this is, this is not just a hobby for me. I really need to dedicate my life to it and quit my job. And part of what really enticed that was that I already worked with in a program called Project Genesis that we formed, my colleague Father Roy Tverdik and I, and then Dr. Don Russo joined us. I was approached by Father Roy Tverdik. He was the director of the shrine in Manorville, the Catholic shrine, and it's called the Our Lady of the Island. And when we met, he asked me to lead a model Seder for him for his church people, and he was also the chaplain on campus at SUNY Old Westbury. So I was apprehensive in the beginning. I didn't know what it meant to do something religiously with Christian. Of course, that was not the issue of being Christian. I've had friends and colleagues, but religiously, I never did anything with.
That was kind of working with other religions.
Yes.
And doing some type of program,
right,
of some kind.
So 2 years into it, and then we took the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and then when we came back, people asked that we teach something, and we were thinking, all right, where do we start? And we thought, let's start in the beginning, and we called it Project Genesis, because we share the text and the theology to a certain degree.
Yes.
And that put me on a 7-year teaching the book of Genesis at the shrine. So I would come from the city every month, and we do that. So it took us 7 years to finish the book of Genesis. And then, so 2 years into it, I quit my job, went to rabbinical school for 4 years, got the job here in Greenport at the synagogue, and only then we finished a year later that I was already here.
But how was that? I mean, how was it going to? It's called
rabbinical school.
Rabbinical school.
Mm-hmm.
How was that experience?
Seminary. It was really. These were great years for me in rabbinical school. It was wonderful. It was different for me in many ways because it was not Orthodox. It's a conservative, the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's in the consortium of Columbia and Union Theological Seminary. So most of my classmates actually in the rabbinical school came out of the joint program of the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia. So it was great to have people with academic knowledge and, of course, interest. But the rabbinical studies itself themselves were great. I was very happy during those years. Yeah.
And the opportunity came up to come out to Greenport after a little bit, or was it before?
It's a great actually story how I got here, because I never, even in rabbinical school, did not think to become a congregational rabbi. It was not even on my horizon. I thought that since I came from big institutions like the military, corporate America, I would be, best serving the Jewish people in a capacity of a Jewish organization. Maybe Israel Advocacy like AIPAC or AJC or other organizations like that. And I actually already had interviews with them. And I took some of the trips with them. But what happened was, in my first year of rabbinical school, there's something called Seminary Shabbat, that the seminarians are sent around the country to different conservative congregations that have relationship with the flagship, so to speak, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and just to kind of keep in touch. And you're supposed to be giving the sermon that Shabbat and mingling with the people. And that's what I did. And at the end of Shabbat, the rabbi and the executive director took me to dinner, and they asked me if I would be interested in becoming in a sense, it's an intern, but it was really in a rabbinic intern or the assistant rabbi, because they were their permanent assistant rabbi was moving away. So, and it was Florida, it was in Sarasota. So I actually flew from New York once a month to Sarasota for a whole year to be the assistant rabbi, and I would do a whole Shabbat there and give sermons, and then the Hebrew school on Sunday. And so it was a great experience, but I even then did not think to become a congregational rabbi. When it was time to decide and the placement process began and congregations started coming to interview at school, my friend, I stayed very good friends with the executive director and of the synagogue I worked with in Sarasota, and he was he probably, I would say, coerced me to become a congregational rabbi. You know, in a way, he said to me, you know, you changed your whole life 3 times over to do this, and you're not going to even look into congregational work, which is really where the rubber meets the road. So all I said to him is, I'm listening, I'm hearing you. I will see what congregations are going to come to interview, and if something will fit, I'll apply to that. Turns out, this place became available, and one of our students that came to the shrine for many years got a job in Greenport, in the church. And when I told her that this is available and I'm thinking maybe to go look at it, she sent them an email to tell them about me and that I've been working in this area for a long time and with the interfaith. So when I walked into the interview at school, and the woman who was sent by the synagogue to interview me, her first question was, "Do you know that you come recommended by the Catholic Church?" So that's how it all started, and you know, things led to another, and this is the only place I really apply to, and here I am, 12 years later.
And what did you think of the area when you initially came out? What did you think of Greenport, or were you thinking, just kind of your thoughts? Were there kind of hesitating?
So I did, and that's why I kept my apartment in the city for 2 years. So I really wanted to make sure this is where I'm moving is something that I would like. I lived in probably the most bustling part of the city. I lived on Central Park South, just behind the Ritz. So I, for 20 years, I basically grew up in the city. I was 22 to 42. I lived in the city, in that apartment.
Wow.
So all my schools, work, everything was my kind of ground. So, of course, coming from that to Greenport, there was a culture shock in many ways. I'm not going to get into everything, but I would say, of course, many of it are pluses. But in a sense that what shocked me religiously was how little attention synagogues and congregations that are far away from major cities receive. I took it for granted that you have all these services, all the facilities, all the education. All you have to do is just step outside and you have everything, right? And when I came here, I realized, no, if you want something here, you have to bring it. And that has been my part of my rabbinate here, was to bring, like, even cemetery services. Everybody was buried in Nassau County or in the local non-Jewish cemeteries here.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to find something that would be reasonably close. So we had an agreement with the synagogue in Calverton, the Jewish synagogue in Calverton, that belongs to our actually movement, the conservative movement. And so many things like this. Speakers, you have to bring people, you have to make them, come here. And then I would say one more thing is, of course, it's a small town that everybody knows everybody for 1,000 years. And it doesn't matter, how long. Sometimes there are people who were, moved here 50 years ago and still are looked upon as foreigners to this area. So that is always, I think, a challenge. I think it's changing now. But that's a beautiful thing about Greenport, of course. And that's why I'm still here. I'm here because of the people.
Yes.
That's why I left the corporate world, and that's why I'm here.
Yes.
Yeah, because I worked so hard in the corporate. I worked at a top investment bank. 100 hours a week is for some people is an average. So, but at least 80 hours a week, I would put into this job, and a lot of times coming on the weekend, and I managed 2 very big international projects. So I realized, I'm working for, I like the people, but, they don't, if I left tomorrow or something happened to me, I don't know how much they care. Right? So I felt that I want to invest my time, which is the main resource we have in life, to my people.
That's much more something that you care about than just
Right.
working within a company.
I love my job. It was very competitive, very. You had to really, and everything we got was the top of the line. It was beautiful. It was great. It was for what it was great. But again, ultimately, I want to invest, and this job is the hardest I've ever had. To being a congregational rabbi is the hardest job I've had. And I was in the military, and I was in the corporate America, in very stressful environments. And there's nothing like this, nothing. Because 100 hours a week, but still then you go home. Here, I live at work. I don't even, some people say, oh, you work from home. And I said, yes, I work from home in many ways, but it's not even that. I live at work. But because I feel that I work for my people, and my people is not just the Jewish people. Yes, it's of course the Jewish people. But it's also the interfaith work that I do. And my people are also people of faith, of any faith. I definitely see them as my people. I always tell them, I don't share your faith, but I share your faith.
Yes. Now, I was just curious, because around 20 years in New York City, were you ever thinking about going back to Israel in that time frame?
To live?
To live.
So I had 2 periods over those 20 years that I lived in Israel for a period of a few months. One was when I left the bank. I needed some sort of to really see if I'm ready for a full religious life as a vocation or as a full-time job. Or studies. But so I went to Jerusalem, and I sublet my apartment in New York, and I lived in the yeshiva of the Western Wall. Literally, I lived above the Western Wall in Jerusalem for 6 months, studying there. And actually, that was exactly the period that Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005. And so I was there for this whole thing. And but after 6 months, I felt like I had to go back. What's home now? I mean, it's so I went back, and that was when I decided to go back to work. And they did call me from work, and I had to kind of come back at that point. But also, this is when I enrolled in the graduate studies. So for the rest of the 4 years, almost 4 years, I studied and worked until 2008, when I left the business world and went to rabbinical school, and everybody thought I was such a great business analyst, because the market took the biggest really tumble since 9/11, I would say, in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis. So it was in October, and I started rabbinical school in August, kind of the end of August, and everybody thought, oh, you saw something, and you knew the market is going to fall. And like, no, I did not know that at all. I followed God, but I thought my journey, and that's what happened.
And then now that you've been in Greenport, you mentioned that this is the toughest job you have, but what do you enjoy about it? What do you enjoy about being a rabbi over the last, has it been
12 years.
12 years now.
12 years. So it's amazing. I never thought that my home is going to move from anywhere from the city. I thought that's it. I mean, I'm a city guy. But actually, when I was, remember when I told you before, when we moved to the house when I was in high school, so I also grew up in the city, but then we moved to outside the city to a house. So apartment to a house. So I would say I've kind of gone through the same process. It was hard in the beginning to adjust that people can just, knock on your door and come in, or just it's, in one sense, it's nice. But I lived in a doorman building for 20 years that announced my guests before they went upstairs. And so that was one, to get used to that. But what I enjoy is also that other side of this, that it is a small community, but very close and warm. And Greenport became home. Aldo's, and walk my dog on the beach. And when I have time, I don't have a lot of time. I mean, I have a kayak that I use. If I use it once a year, I'm lucky.
Yes.
But when I do, it's nice. It's just, it's the people. It's beautiful here, of course, and it's there's many pluses, but on the religious side, there are minuses, because we don't have a lot of kids here. Jewish kids. This is everything we have to do. You have to gather the people. A lot of gathering the people that in the city you don't have to do. They're there. There's always a critical mass. We call it a minyan. A minyan is minyan is 10 people. Is the quorum for prayer. But in a sense, you have to work for it. But then the people who come, it's all your people that you see all the time, and you get close to them, and their children and their grandchildren. It's so, I would say this is why I'm here, the people.
And with the Jewish community out here, have you noticed any changes in the last 12 years? You mentioned that maybe there's not as many as in the city, but what do you think of the Jewish community out here?
So mostly are really non-observant. So really, I in the city, even during my seminary years, I kept going to the same synagogue that I've been going for many years, and it was an Orthodox synagogue. So I'm used to being with people who are observant and feel that it's an obligation to go to pray, right? Just in Catholicism, Christianity, you have the day of obligation. It's an obligation. But the mindset of non-observant Jews, of course, there are our brothers and sisters. There's no question there. Of course, I don't view them as less Jewish in any way. But in terms of synagogue life and work, it's a whole different approach with people who sometimes don't believe. They're not faithful and they're not observant, but they still want to be connected to the Jewish community and what we do and events. So that is that's the change that I feel. But also the Jewish community here is changing because of course, people coming out here more, moving out here more because of COVID, because of other changes. So we have more Jews who are interested in synagogue life, and some of them have children. So it's a welcome change in many ways. Of course, it drives the prices up, but overall, it's a welcome change.
Yes. And in terms of the Project Genesis, you're still working with the interreligious harmony. What programs are you doing now? Are you doing something at Peconic Landing?
So what happened was after we finished 7 years at the shrine, so I was already in Greenport, and there were local people who were asking to teach, that I would teach just like we taught at the shrine. At that point, I started with Dr. Don Russo, and we started at the First Universalist Church on Main Street in Southold, where the turn is. Beautiful 1830s, I think, church. It was one of the most beautiful churches out here. So when we were looking for a place to teach, we kind of asked around, and we were very welcomed at that place. So we started there, and we finished a whole year. This time what we did is we taught the New Testament, and I would interject with the Jewish connections or roots to the New Testament. At the shrine, what we did when we taught the book of Genesis, I really taught the book, and Father Roy would interject with the Catholic understandings of it. Here we flipped it, and we had, like, the first session, we had 90 people came. Of course, it kind of balanced to about 40 to 50 people consistently. But then after we finished the first year, we taught the Gospel of Luke. And then I went to Israel on my annual pilgrimage with Project Genesis. And that, when I was in Israel that week, the church burnt down. So, and they just rebuilt it.
Oh, yes.
After what, maybe 8 years.
Wow.
Right? 10, maybe 10 years. So that was one. So we started here, and then we were invited by one of our students. I didn't know really what he did at that point. It was John May, who was the founder of Peconic Landing. So he invited us to teach there. So for 8 years, we did that at Peconic Landing, and now we're still going to teach there and do special events. But we actually moved our monthly lectures now to further west, because this is really where most of our people are. So we are doing it in Shoreham now, at a church. So for our programs, it's better to have a house of worship as a venue, because there we're more free to be religious. You know, and at Peconic Landing and places that are not strictly religious, I think it's part of also their mandate. They're not supposed to introduce religious concepts per se. So it was more of like an educational program. So we definitely continue that. We never stopped. We have at Project Genesis, we have mainly 4 events that we do. We start with the Model Seder, and we just had our annual Model Seder last Tuesday. We had over 100 people. Nice. Then we take our pilgrimage, usually in February. This year we couldn't go in February. because of the situation. So we'll probably go in November.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other major thing we do. And then we do the monthly lectures. And then finally we have an event in the winter that we call it Between the Lights. And that's between the lights of Hanukkah and Christmas.
Mm.
So we have a spring event, a fall or winter event, and then pilgrimage and monthly lectures. That's really what we do.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I want to add one thing about the ecumenical work that I do. It's interfaith, but also ecumenical.
Mm-hmm.
Greenport, and this is one of the reasons I enjoy my work here very much, is it's a very religious town, and it has all the churches pretty much of major denominations.
Yes.
And that's beautiful because we're friends. We get together probably, I would say, on average, every month or 2 months. We have events together. We just had a model Seder at the synagogue for GEM, the Greenport Ecumenical Ministries, that we had over 60 people attending from all the churches. We usually do it during Holy Week because it's the last Wednesday of the Lent period, the Lent season. So there are 6, starting with Ash Wednesday and going to. We usually do the last Wednesday, which is a model Seder, which was the Last Supper.
Yes.
So, it's beautiful here. In that sense, I can't take it for granted. Because I speak to my colleagues and I know what's going on, and I don't know anybody that has this kind of ecumenism in a village like this, and including, of course, the rabbi as part and parcel of that organization. Mm-hmm. It's religious here is ubiquitous, it really is. You can't avoid it.
Yes. And I wanted to ask, because you mentioned you weren't able to go in February, but I had a question. How do we go about working together for promoting interreligious harmony in the Holy Land?
So for many years, we have been promoting peace in the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. When I left Israel, moved to New York, I was an Israeli, right? I discovered my Judaism, more here. And every year that I would go back to Israel, especially after starting to work with Project Genesis, I started seeing Israel as not just a political entity that it is, but really as the Holy Land, which meant Rehovot in a sense of widening the definition of that land, that I absolutely see the place of Christian and Muslims in that land. Mm-hmm. That being said, we wrote a whole peace proposal for the Middle East and have been promoting it every year we've been in Israel. We did a big event in Jerusalem in 2019, and then in 2020, we were supposed to have a big event in my hometown, in one of the museums. And this was amazing because it was the first time that the municipality supported interfaith work, which was incredible. Mm-hmm. The only issue was that night, it was March 5th. That night, 2020, was the night that Israel closed for COVID. It was the first night that they restricted gatherings. Mm. And of course, everybody freaked out anyways by coming to any big event. Mm-hmm. So we just ended up having like 50 people, our group and a few family friends. And so we still had that event, and it was a good event. But what I'm saying is that for years, because I also came from the military, and I left the military because I am a peaceful person. I know how to fight. I know how to, I've grown up in a war zone, basically. But maybe that's why I don't like to fight. I don't want to engage in wars. I appreciate peace, you know. So we've been pushing for that. And I know from my experience that if we don't, it'll end up what is happening right now. I knew that, of course. Everybody who lives in Israel knows that. So we tried our best to diffuse it. So that's one thing that we've done that. I have to fast forward to this year on October 7th because I think it demonstrates everything we were trying to probably avoid. So as I told you, I went back to school to finish another master's. I started 12 years ago, and I took both semesters at Columbia because it's part of our consortium, and these are the classes that I really liked. But the second semester was October 7th. We had just come back, of course, from the high holidays. And so the whole semester, I found myself in a situation that I didn't choose. I didn't, on a campus that immediately turned the rhetoric to Jews are white European colonizers, and therefore there's by any means you can redeem the land. And I'm taking a class. The first class I took was in the Jewish department. This was not even in the Jewish department. So we had students from all over the world, literally. I mean, it was a class of, I think, 25, something like that. And you look around the table, and everybody was from a different country. Because it was also about immigration, and it was immigration to New York. So when I was telling my story, the professor asked me to tell my story of my parents' immigration from Yemen, and that Jews are not all Europeans, and definitely not the origin. Our origin is not in Europe. And none of them knew that Jews were expelled also and had to be displaced, and even in greater numbers than the Arab Palestinians. That's one thing. What we always pushed for, always, and when I was working on the peace proposal in Israel and here, I interviewed top politicians in Israel that I know from personal relations and other, and they all kept saying, we stay away from religion because it's a hot potato. But guess what? This is a religious conflict. And the sooner you understand that, it will be easier to deal with it. It's so painful and hard to begin with. So I think the first thing, to your question, what do we do? I think the first thing is to be truthful. Acknowledge these basic premises. One, it's a religious conflict. So the means by which it will be resolved have to involve serious religious conversation. And that's what we're doing. And when we're in Israel, we always include Muslims in interfaith. We had an interfaith prayer in a excavated synagogue in Magdala. You know, Mary Magdalene. So Magdala is the village that she lived in. It's right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And it was hidden. And it was excavated in just the last 10 years. And it's a synagogue from first century that has the only depiction of the menorah, of the candelabra in the temple, other than the depiction on in Rome, the arch, the Titus, the Arch of Titus.
Oh,
because when they destroyed the temple in 70 A.D., CE, they brought all the vessels to Rome. right? And it was a parade of victory, that finally we were able to break the Judean empire and their rebellious activities. So this was the only place that has the depiction of the menorah from the temple. It's incredible. It's an incredible place. But we know the priest there. Actually it belongs to a Christian. It's the Knights of that's not Columbus. The something of, I forget the group that owns the place, but they built a big church also on the premise. So this is kind of when we go to Galilee, this is where we stay and work. And we had in 2020 they let us pray in the excavated synagogue. So we had our first prayer ever in that synagogue. There was a Jewish group that they let them pray for a little bit, but we were the second group to pray there after 2,000 years. But we were also the only, of course, group that did Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. We had a Jewish, Christian, Muslim event, prayer service at that synagogue.
Wow.
This is what we do when we go to Israel. We're very, very serious in bringing everything together and everybody together. But you have to acknowledge that it's a religious conflict, one. Second, the rhetoric that says that Jews are not indigenous in the land, of course, first of all, it's a lie. It's not just inaccurate. It's telling me I don't exist. And actually, most of the Jews who live in Israel are from Arab countries, from the East. They're not Western. They're not white. They're as brown and indigenous as anybody else. And these two premises have to be on the table. And the third one, it's not a premise, but it has to be cleared out of the negotiations, is what the Palestinians want as a right of return. Well, nobody's speaking to me about returning to Yemen and having my parents' home for 2,000 years that they had. They left with their shirt on their back, So this has to be a wash, Okay, there was a war. We suffered greatly. You suffered greatly. If you want to finish the suffering, please come to the table, but with the truth. Yes, of course there was suffering on what's happening in Gaza now. Of course, I cringe. This is horrible on a human level, that people lose their homes. I know what it means. My parents were immigrants, refugees, not immigrants. My parents were refugees. I'm an immigrant. I know what it means to leave your home. And I think it's unless you really have to, people want to stay home and not see their homes destroyed. So we're trying to prevent that. And I think this is, to your question, really, how is it going to be resolved? By acknowledging first these premises. I just want to add to that one thing, is that on campus, when this whole thing started, my professor, who knew me from the previous semester, asked me to, and in the previous semester, she asked me to write about the Project Genesis pilgrimages to the Holy Land, because it's a new historical phenomenon. Since Vatican Council in the 60s changed its conversation with other religions and acknowledged that Judaism is the elder in the faith, and we're not enemies, and they're not holding us accountable for killing Jesus 2,000 years ago, at least not the Jews who live today. It changed the whole environment. So it opened the door for 30 years of dialoguing between institutions, between congregations, but then they took it a step forward 30 years later. In the last 3 decades, people have started also traveling on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. We started almost 20 years ago. So we're part of the new historical phenomenon. So she knew, and I wrote about it for my final paper, and she knew that's what I do. So once October 7 happened, she immediately asked me to do something in the interfaith capacity on campus. And of course, I was very happy to do it, and I started kind of investigating around campus and seeing what's the best way to do it. Turns out that the Muslim organizations didn't really want to talk to the Jewish organizations at that point. It was too raw. I don't know. Right now, I have to see how it is now. I have to follow up on that. Mm-hmm. But what I ended up doing is I created an event on November 30th on campus that commemorates the Jews from Arab countries. It's the day that is designated for that. It's the day of commemorating. The long full name is the day to commemorate the departure and expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. But in short, Jews are not what you're saying. The Jews came from Europe and colonized the land. It's inaccurate, and it's such a harming rhetoric, because of course a good American, especially a college kid, right, that all they want to do is be, right, a social warrior, social justice warrior. Of course, on the surface, if you present it as somebody stole from somebody land and they're white and they're colonizers, of course, we immediately go in our American psyche to slavery, to South Africa, to all these places that were colonized, absolutely, by Europeans, North Africa, many places in the world.
But it doesn't apply.
But it does not apply to this situation. And that is the biggest challenge. And I think that to fight that inaccurate rhetoric, all we have to do is push that rhetoric. No, we're not. We are indigenous. Nobody can tell me I'm not indigenous. And most Jews who live in Israel are not from Europe, are indigenous to the land. They never left the land. We were all part of the Ottoman Empire. Nobody had a state outside the construct of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, Yemen existed. There was a part of, I guess, the Iraq, in one sense. Yes, countries existed. But once they became under the umbrella of the Ottoman Empire, there were different rules. It was one big empire, so people could move within the empire. So there was no state of Palestine. There were Arabs who lived in the region that was called Palestine, a biblical region. It's not the original Palestinians, Philistines, lived actually where Gaza is now in the biblical time. But the Palestinians today don't connect themselves like we as Jews, genetically or by extension, to those Philistines. The reason they're called Palestinians or Palestine is because the Roman Emperor Hadrian changed the name of Judea to Palestine because he wanted to erase the memory of the Judeans from the land, because they rebelled. They wanted to be their own sovereignty. Okay. But to say that he was successful in erasing the memory of Israel from that area, again, all the academics and all the people who have half a knowledge, for them to embrace that kind of rhetoric, it just doesn't make sense. You know that the West Bank is Judea and Samaria. It's Judea and Samaria. They changed the name to Philistina to erase the name, but they can't erase the history and the archaeological findings and everything else. This was our temple. This was our place. So I would say finally, in a sense of resolving this issue also, is to say, where is the Jewish land here? Do you accept any Jewish land in this area? Okay, those who accepted, we can talk to them. But people who violated humanity on October 7th, I don't see how you can talk to these people. And I'm in the business of talking to people, but maybe that's where you draw the line. For conversations and dialogues and coming together to have any meaning, you have to also know when you have to stop talking.
But even like you mentioned, even just dealing with things in the U.S., with some of that rhetoric kind of going around in the academic institutions, kind of the oppressor and colonizing, and you think it kind of simplifies things too much, where they're just wanting to attach that to, even if it is someone that is a Jewish person that came from Europe, it still shouldn't be that they should be treating anyone of Jewish descent that way. But how do you think, because there was a lot that went on in universities across the country, and saying there was a rise of anti-Semitism, and do you think there were some biases, or with the way they handled some things, where they sided with one group over another in some ways?
On campuses?
Yeah.
The administration or the students?
Well, it was kind of coming from both sides, because you had stuff in how things were handled in the administration part, and then you had students that might have, if they, for example, they said something like, well, you can't talk about this, you're part of the problem, or if there was any complaints coming from Jewish students. I'm not saying that, I've just heard things where stuff happened where there might have been saying they weren't treated right in certain instances. And
are you talking about Jewish students, or the Palestinian?
Talking about Jewish
pro-Palestinian students?
Yeah, some of just the pro-Palestinian students, and how they might have treated some of the Jewish students that were just going about.
Yeah, I mean, I felt it firsthand. I was right there. And the after one of the big demonstrations that were there, I think it was October 23rd, and it literally ended, the demonstration was like from 1 to 2, and my class started at 2. So literally students came from that demonstration. And this is when my professor asked me to tell the story of my family, to acknowledge that we're not white colonizers. So, and they didn't know the story and everything. So the students themselves then started showing, with a couple of them with keffiyehs. You know, the keffiyeh is the traditional Muslim head covering. So it really felt very tense. And my professor asked me if I feel safe on campus. I feel as a rabbi, I had to continue being visibly Jewish. It's almost like wearing uniforms, and people should be able to approach you if they need, of course, hopefully only positively. But so I kept, of course, wearing my yarmulke. But to say that I didn't feel the tension, of course, it was. And then two student organizations were suspended. One was Jewish organization that are pro-Palestinians, and then there was a Palestinian group that were pro-Palestinian. But they were shouting from the river to the sea, and they were shouting by all means, and that Israel is a colonizer and a genocide. And really, I felt like I was in 1930s somewhere in Europe. And many of the Jewish students felt that way. I mean, with the masses, they have more people, of course. You know, we're a handful of people. And when they bring these big crowds, yes, it's intimidating. You know, so, but the rhetoric has to be truthful for it to move from a war to, to at least on the process of peace. Because if the world is just going to force Israel into things, it's going to blow up again.
Mm-hmm. But just in coming back to the North Fork, what do you hope for the future of the community out here and just the North Fork in general?
I think it's a wonderful place, and it's. I don't think there are many places like this in the I would say in America that are fairly peaceful. People help each other, and we have organizations that help the poor and the needy. So it's a nice balance. From my perspective, as a resident of the North Fork and as a rabbi here, I would want to see the Jewish community congregates more. Even if they're not religious, they're not observant, but to congregate more as Jews and understand that we have to connect to our community and roots to survive certain periods. And I think we are in a very challenging period. To be clergy right now, and especially Jewish clergy, is very challenging. So I would want any support, and also support other Jews.
Just to kind of make sure that there's still a healthy community and people don't feel like, oh, I don't have to, or if they feel afraid, or if they don't, because you said there's a lot of Jewish people out here that don't, or that are...
they're not observant, or affiliated, with a specific house of worship. Maybe we need a JCC, something that, and I have been talking about that, creating something that is like a shul with the pool. That was the original structure of the that what became the Jewish community centers. They started with the shul with the pool in Cleveland in the 50s, and that really was supposed to give answer to those people who were not observant but still wanted to be part of the Jewish community. So there was the shul. Shul means synagogue in Yiddish, and school, and the pool for the everybody else.
And then was there anything else you'd like to discuss or say that we haven't talked about?
We've covered a lot of ground. So I don't really think of anything. I want to wish the world a peace, and that we learn how to share holy sites, and because holiness, and maybe I'll just conclude with this paradigm of living life either as water or fire. When you live your life as water, if you share your water, you're left with whatever you didn't share, right? So you're diminished in one sense, right? If I share half a glass of water with you, I'll remain with half a glass of water. But when you live like fire, you can share infinitely. And the religious spirit is to say, yes, of course, there are always constraints of territory. Absolutely. But within that, there's a lot of room for inclusion, acceptance, education about the other. Much to do. There's a lot to do in that. So I would say the world should maybe move to that mindset, that just like in Jerusalem in ancient times, when all the Jews came to celebrate one of the major pilgrimage holidays, the Talmud, the oral tradition, the Jewish oral tradition, said that it could have been 2 million people there. But one of the 10 miracles that happened during those times is that nobody said, I don't have place. I don't have space. So when you have space in your heart, finding the territory makes it a lot easier.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming in today and telling your story and talking to you about what you're doing in the community, especially with Project Genesis and all the great work you're doing. And it was really great to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
God bless.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 62 with Rabbi Gadi Capela. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.